correctly, please correct me. Mr. Lewis, that the correct pronoun? Or do I?
So actually, the honorific would be mix, MX.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Mix, okay. Mixed state. I'm starting my education right here. Mix Lewis. And I do know.
And it's the same for Helen, yep.
So a part of this conversation I have, you got to educate me on the pronouns. So I appreciate that. So that's a good beginning. So mix, I didn't know, that's new. I had never heard that one before. So thank you for that, Mr. Lewis, or Mix Lewis.
There you go.
All right. And Mix Mays for coming out, both part of Side by Side. I want to say to you that we are going to be doing a diversity luncheon for 4 of them this year, and every single year annually, at least while I have this position, we'll focus on the LGBTQ community. And so I reached out to Side by Side because they have been wonderful collaborators with us in the past, and asked them what was an issue that they felt was significant in going into this year, and because I did not want to assume that I knew. So I reached out, and Mr. Lewis, he brought to me this particular subject matter. And so I'm really excited to hear more, learn more. And I'm excited that all of you all decided to join us, because I know we had competing interests going on out there right now. And you decided to be with us. So we are, so again, I want to extend my thanks to both Mix Mays and Mix Lewis for coming out and being part of this conversation and educating us. And more importantly, thank you all, after working all day, for being here with us to hear this information. Last, I do want to say that we are going to be recording this and we will be posting it. They've already granted us permission. So we will be sending the recording out to every person who signed up. The information to me is so important. I really do stress to forward the information on if you think it will be important and something that needs to be heard by other members of your school community. All right, and so I now turn it over. Oh, I do want to say one thing. Mr. Mix Mays will be monitoring the chat. So just so you'll know, she is actually, or excuse me, Mix is actually monitoring the chat, and Mix Lewis will be giving the presentation, just for clarity of that.
Great, thank you, Dr. Manns. And good afternoon, everyone. My appreciation as well for taking time after a long day to engage with us. When Dr. Manns approached us and said, what's one thing that you want to talk about? I said, there's no way I can talk about one thing given this year. So we're going to talk about 3 short things that really could be their own hour-long conversations. And that's the pandemic, the Black Lives Matter, and the election, and how it's impacting LGBTQ students. So a little bit about what we're going to do. Every time we talk about the community that we serve, we try to provide a little bit of context about who they are, what they look like. And so we're going to do a little bit of 101, but I want to be clear that the purpose of today's conversation is not a 101 training. It's to give you information about the services Side by Side offers and what our youth are experiencing right now, given everything happening in the world. And so while we are going to go over some one-on-one stuff, you may find yourself with a lot of questions. If that's the case, we would love for you to join us for one of our basics trainings. We provide those openly via virtual formats like this throughout. We do one every month. And then we also do them for school districts, and sometimes individual schools will contact us to have our basics training come in. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. In fact, that'll be in that next section on information on Side by Side, our programs and resources. Talk a little bit about what the pandemic looks like specifically for LGBTQ students, and a little bit about Black Lives Matter and unpacking Black LGBTQ youth trauma and what that looks like. And then wrap up with the hot topic, as next week is the official election. So let's jump right on in. Now, I'm going to pause after each section, and DeHaven/Helen, they use both names. They're monitoring the chat, as Dr. Mann said. So please drop your questions in the chat as they come up. We will definitely do our best to get to all of them. So we've been throwing around the acronym. Want to make sure everybody's on the same page. LGBTQ stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and questioning. Now, the term queer is a complicated one. For some people, they will only think of it as a derogatory slur. I know when I was a kid, smear the queer was a term used on the playground and nobody wanted to be the queer. But ostensibly, queer means different from what's expected or different from the norm, and has become to mean specifically different in terms of gender and sexuality. And many people, particularly many young people, are embracing the term queer because it has a little bit of fluidity and ambiguity built into it. It's not a discrete term the same way lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender is. In other words, its definition is a little more fluid. And so a lot of people are embracing that. We're also seeing it being embraced in pop culture, Queer Eye, Queer as Folk, even in academia, queer studies, queer theory, etc. Some people have even used the term to be an umbrella for the whole community, but I would caution against that because, again, some people view it as a derogatory slur. It's always okay to mirror someone else's language. If you have a student that comes to you and comes out as queer, saying they're a queer student is perfectly acceptable. That's how they've identified themselves. But it's not a term I would use lightly because, again, it does have that derogatory past history connected to it. Now, the reality is there are tons of words that people use to define their gender and sexuality. And when a person, particularly a young person, finds a term that fits their reality, it feels like they found a home. It feels like they found a community. Now, some of these words may be brand new to you, and some of them you may have known for a long time. But remember, when someone finds this term that defines who they are, it means they found that community. It reduces that feeling of isolation, that feeling of loneliness, that feeling like they're the only one. So it's important that when a young person is sharing a term that you're not familiar with, you can ask them, could you tell me what that means to you? Because you may not know what it means, but it also is very personal. So you want to engage with them and learn more about that term from them. It's not helpful to say things like, I can't keep up with all the terms, or there's so many letters, and what do all these mean? Because that further isolates someone, making them feel like who they are is so unique and so different that there's no one else like them out there. We add that plus to denote that there's all these terms out there to define our gender and sexuality. And we could spend our time going over all the definitions, but we don't really do that in our basics training. Instead, we look at identity in terms of a spectrum. Now, no model is perfect, but we found this to be an easy way for people to digest an understanding of the community. So when we talk about LGBTQ folks, we're talking about sex assigned at birth, gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation as four separate yet connected parts of who we are. So again, these are separate yet connected parts. So you may have someone who's transgender, in other words, their sex assigned at birth differs from what we would expect related to their gender identity. For example, maybe they were assigned female at birth but identify as a boy or a man. Or maybe they identify as non-binary. That's transgender. Someone can be both transgender and gay. They're not mutually exclusive categories because sexuality is different than gender identity. It's also important, again, to recognize what is sort of expected in our culture. What's that default that we assume happens? And that's what these lines look like, what is sometimes referred to as the gender binary. In other words, that's someone who is cisgender, meaning their sex assigned at birth aligns with what we would expect related to their gender identity. They're gender conforming, meaning how they present themselves or express themselves is lined up with their gender identity, or rather what we would expect. And they're heterosexual. They're attracted to the quote unquote opposite gender. This is an assumption made about everyone, that everyone fits into one of these categories, this blue line or this pink line at the poles of our spectrum. And when we talk about the LGBTQ community, it's important to recognize that most of us don't fit these pole expectations. And so we don't see ourselves reflected in curriculum or in media or in conversations or even in community in positive ways. And that further leads to that isolation. So you're going to have colleagues and students and families who are going to have those straight lines, but you're also going to have lines that are going to look like this. And our goal at Side by Side is to ensure that you're prepared to best serve all the students and families in your community, and that LGBTQ students feel affirmed and accepted, and dare we say even celebrated as their full authentic selves in your schools. Now, we're also more than one thing. We're complex. We have more than just our gender and our sexuality. And so when we talk about identity, it is a complex matrix of multiple parts of who we are that are always around us. In other words, I can't be gay today and white tomorrow and middle class on Thursday. I'm all those things all the time. And those different identities are going to intersect and impact each other and interact with each other. And for some LGBTQ youth, being LGBTQ is their top priority. And for some, it doesn't even breach the top 10. We are complex people. And when we talk about the community, we want to leave you again for our brief 101, some key things to keep in mind. One is that gender identity and sexual orientation are two different yet connected parts of who we are. The needs of transgender students may look very different than their cisgender, gay, lesbian, or bisexual peers. It's also, again, important to recognize that LGBTQ people are diverse in their experiences and their identities. There's not a monolith. For some people, what they're exposed to is their vision of the full community. And so for a long time, people thought the LGBTQ community looks like Will from Will and Grace or Ellen DeGeneres. But the reality is LGBTQ youth are also youth of color, immigrant and refugee youth, youth with disabilities, youth from rural communities, youth from lower economic, high economic, middle economic families, etc. There's not a monolithic experience. And all LGBTQ students are going to need unique things depending on their other identities and their other education needs. Transgender people often face unique experiences due to how they're treated both within the LGBTQ community and society as a whole. We've seen transgender people be singled out in the community as a target, and we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like in a moment in the presentation. But what we found is that transgender students often disrupt school policy because school policies weren't written to really think of how transgender students might interact with them. We'll talk a little bit about how side-by-side can assist in that avenue in the next section. But as I mentioned before, LGBTQ people are part of every community. We know of LGBTQ students in every middle school and high school and some elementary schools in Henrico County. Sometimes they're out to their teachers and their principal and the school leadership, and sometimes they're not. We have yet to meet a school that doesn't have an LGBTQ student, whether they're in the closet or out publicly. So it's important to recognize that these students are already in your classroom, are already virtual learning with you, are already a part of your community. Now that's the end of our first section on sort of basic information to get us all on the same page. Helen, were there any questions that came up in the chat or were submitted beforehand that we want to touch on?
So far, not in the chat, but one question that was submitted earlier was, where are the blind spots when it comes to being more supportive and endorsing all lifestyles?
Great. So I think one of the blind spots that we often see is, again, a thought that LGBTQ students are only LGBTQ. So I'll give you an example. We had a student that was in the 8th grade. He was a transgender boy, so assigned female at birth, identified as a boy, and he was in a school, middle school, and the school was super supportive. They had good policies, they had good practices. He was able to use his chosen name. He was able to use the boys' bathroom. He had a really good experience in his identity being affirmed. And we get to the end of the year, and he says, you know, I've learned a lot. I really appreciate all the support, but I still can't read. This student was severely dyslexic. He had an IEP, and the school, to be honest with you, forgot about it because he became the transgender student, and they wanted to get that right. And they forgot that there was a whole student there that had other needs. Now that student went on to transfer to another school where he could get more specialized help with his dyslexia. And he had to start the process again of trying to make sure he was affirmed in his identity in that new school. So again, one of those blind spots is not seeing the full student that's there. Another one is language that's constantly changing and evolving. So for example, terms like lifestyle or sexual preference were once acceptable. They're really not anymore. We talk about people's sexual orientation, not sexual preference. We talk about people's identity, not lifestyle. And again, making those missteps may not seem like a big thing. You just used the wrong word, you weren't trying to be harmful. But those words have connotations for people in the community and a lot of deep-seated fear and hurt that comes with them. So terms like sexual preference harkens back to the conversation that sexual orientation is a choice, and a bad choice at that. And it reminds LGBTQ people that who we are is up for conversation and not something that should be validated. Again, it's a simple change of a word, but it means a big difference to say sexual orientation versus sexual preference. The last thing I will say is that you must recognize that when we talk about systemic oppression, when we talk about systems, we're not looking for a villain. A lot of times I will say, you know, this school is not set up for transgender students. That's the case in most schools. That doesn't mean that the principal of that school hates transgender kids. What it means is that when the system was created, transgender students were not a part of the thought process in the development of that product, that policy, that practice, that school, that curriculum, etc. So you don't have to feel attacked if someone is bringing up some concerns around policy or practice. It doesn't mean that you as an individual have necessarily done something wrong. It means the system isn't built to include other people who have different identities outside of that norm, that expectation, right? We see this with other things too. You see it with race, you see it with religion. We can give you tons of examples, but I think that's the other blind spot, is approach it from the system was created without thinking about LGBTQ students. So now that we know better, how can we do better? And how can we change the system to better meet the needs of all of our students, including LGBTQ kids? Right? Helen, did you have anything to add to that?
No. And so far, no new questions yet.
Okay. So don't be shy in the chat, especially when we get into the next section around our programs and resources. And don't feel that you can't ask questions about what we already covered. This is time for you all as well to ask those questions, right? So a little bit about Side by Side. So a little history first and foremost. We were founded in 1991 as ROSME, or the Richmond Organization for Sexual Minority Youth. We upgraded our name in 2016 to better reflect the fullness of what we do with the help of the VCU Brand Center. Our mission is that we are dedicated to creating supportive communities where Virginia's LGBTQ youth can define themselves, belong, and flourish. And we mainly work with LGBTQ youth and young adults in Richmond, but we also have offices in Charlottesville and some work in Petersburg. In November of 2019, we made a public commitment to Black LGBTQ youth specifically, because we were realizing that we were not seeing numbers comparable to population in terms of Black youth accessing our resources and services. And we recognized that when Side by Side was founded, we haven't looked at it with a specific key towards racial equity. And so we made a commitment from the board and the staff to really look at our policies and practices to ensure that Black LGBTQ youth and families can best access our resources, that they are culturally competent, that they are meeting the needs of everyone. Now, a lot of people say, well, why just Black youth? Well, that was our biggest opportunity when we looked into our own data. And so that's where we're starting. We're also doing things and looking at how to better serve Latinx youth and Asian youth and youth with disabilities. That's a conversation we're constantly having to improve our programs and services. But our biggest opportunity as an organization was specifically to look at the needs of Black LGBTQ youth. And you can read more about that on our website. In the Richmond area, technically, we are just over the line in Henrico. We can actually see the city-county line from our office door if you were to go outside and look. Our youth center is located on Westwood Avenue, across from the new Topgolf facility. If you're driving down I-95, you may have seen it. And we have a beautiful mural painted on the side of our building that you see here pictured. We're mostly known for our support groups. And so we put in our virtual Richmond-based groups here because that's typically where we would see Henrico County students accessing services. And so in Richmond, on Tuesday nights, we have our LGBTQ youth ages 14 to 20. So that's sort of high school age and a little bit beyond. On Wednesday nights, we have our LGBTQ middle school youth, which is ages 11 to 14, but really 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. On Thursday nights, we have a group for transgender youth, again, ages 14 to 20, that older high school range. And then our newest group is on Monday nights, and that's for LGBTQ youth of color. And that group in particular is also facilitated by staff and volunteers of color. So it looks at specifically that intersection between race and sexuality and gender. All of these groups are virtual right now. All of these groups are free, doesn't cost anything. In Virginia, 14 is a magical age. So if you're over the age of 14, a youth can access an after-school program like Side by Side without parental permission. Although we always encourage youth to let their family know what they're involved in, but sometimes that means they have to do that on their own time, as saying they come to Side by Side may out them as a member of the LGBTQ community. If they're under the age of 14, we do ask for parental or guardian permission, and we have that information available on our website now. It's easy and simple to register and sign up. When we're in person, which we're all hoping starts back up next year, we'll be able to continue offering our meal program, which is a full dinner at every support group. We also have some other resources that I'll talk about in a moment at our Richmond Youth Center. But I think what's important here is that we have done our best to lower the gates to have youth access our services in the pandemic. And what we're seeing is that because youth don't have to physically get to us, we're seeing youth from more rural areas, youth that maybe didn't have access to transportation, youth that maybe didn't feel as comfortable in an in-person setting. We have a lot of youth who have anxiety around meeting new people because of their experiences they've had with their peers. And so walking into an in-person group with 30 or 40 young people can be a little overwhelming. A virtual platform actually might be easier for some folks. So we're still exploring what things look like when we're back in person, but we imagine there'll be some sort of virtual offering even when we're back to in-person setting. There's no cost for any of these groups. And I think what's really important here is to recognize that Henrico County leadership, as well as Richmond City and countless other districts, have recognized Side by Side as a viable resource for your students. So you shouldn't hesitate to share this information with the students in your class or in your school. Some of our other school support services, many of which are actually run by Helen, who's on the call with us. One is our youth support coordinators. These are volunteer staff within your school. You could be one of these folks. You receive additional training, resources, and serve as a liaison between your school and Side by Side. Helen sets you up with additional information, resources, connection to other youth support coordinators at other schools so you can share ideas, share best practices, etc. This is a newer program, and you can, again, learn more about it on our website, and we would love to have some youth support coordinators in Henrico County. We also do support for gender and sexuality alliances, what we used to call gay-straight alliances. Support not only those advisors, many of which are also YSCs, but leaders in those student groups. Some GSAs are meeting virtually, and we're happy to also meet with their GSAs in the virtual setting where we can. We had hoped to do an annual summit starting off this year, but of course the pandemic changed those plans. But we're still looking into possibly doing something virtual in the near future, so be on the lookout. And the last piece is training and technical support. We do a lot of trainings for K-12 schools. If you're in our footprint, which Henrico County Public Schools is, we receive grant funding that ensures that the school districts don't have to pay anything for the training and technical support we offer. We're happy to provide that training to your team. We're just looking for an invitation, and you can find more information on our website and even sign up for training there. For older young adults, 18 to 25, we do offer some homelessness services. We have a host home program, which is sort of like Airbnb without a fee. Person has a spare bedroom. They let somebody stay with them until they're back to a place of stability. Pride Place at Virginia Home for Boys and Girls has 7 young people who are LGBTQ and between the ages of 18 to 25 who are staying on their campus with support from us until they're able to, again, get to a place of stability. We also offer case management services and additional financial support for homelessness diversion. Some other youth services, again, to note, we have one-on-one mental health counseling out of our Richmond offices with Dr. Lisa Griffin, who specializes in LGBTQ youth and specifically transgender youth. That mental health counseling is at no cost to the youth or their family. No insurance, no Medicaid, no filing, no copay. It's 100% free. They can get up to 6 free sessions with Dr. Griffin at no cost to them or their family. And if they want to continue in the program, they can do so by writing a simple letter outlining what they've learned and what they hope to gain by continuing in therapy. We have a clothing closet and hygiene products, lockers, and a library, all at our Richmond Youth Center. And when we're in person, we provide regular HIV and STI screenings, as well as support for survivors of violence through our partnership with the Nations Foundation and the Virginia Anti-Violence Project, respectively. We already talked about our meals program, those dinners for our in-person support groups. We also have transition materials for transgender youth, chest binders and packers, etc. And even though we're not open at our youth center, youth can access any of our services and resources simply by emailing us and asking to set up a one-on-one appointment. When we're in person, we also do some fabulous social programs like a summer pool party, holiday celebrations, and a prom every year. The last piece to note is that Side by Side has been working with the Virginia Department of Education on guidance for transgender student policies following the passage of HB 145, SB 161, that requires Virginia schools to have policies in place by the 21-22 school year for how to treat transgender students in these specific areas. Helen and I have been working with a team of advocates across the Commonwealth to ensure that schools are ready to meet the needs of their transgender students. And if you've got specific questions, we're happy to answer them here, but we're also happy to set up time to work with you or your school on how to roll out policies that include everyone. So I'm going to pause here again, see if there's any questions before we get to our next section on the impact of COVID. Helen, do we have any questions?
Yeah, we definitely have questions. So the first one, will we consider continuing virtual groups after the pandemic?
Absolutely. We're looking into what's possible right now with that. We have a lot of young people that I think, similar to UL School, would love to be back in person. But we're also hearing from some folks that they really like the virtual setting and we're able to access us easier because they don't have access to transportation maybe, or a supportive family member or friend who can get them to us. So we're absolutely looking into keeping some sort of virtual option after we're back to in-person. And we'll keep you updated as soon as we make that decision. To be fair, we really don't know when we're going to be back in person right now. So I don't have an exact timeline for you, but we are looking into it.
The next one is, what is the most common way students join our support groups, such as recommendations from friends, teachers, etc.?
So actually, Helen, you might want to answer this before I do. Do you have thoughts on how, because you work directly with our support groups, how do you see most young people connect with us?
Yeah, I would say it varies by age. Usually with the middle school group, we'll get emails from parents, guardians who their youth just came out or they're concerned about their mental health and they know that their youth wants support. So they'll reach out and say, hey, can my kiddo join your group and just connect with other youth who share the identity? And I'm going to absolutely brag about our middle schoolers. They are awesome. They take incredible care of each other. Cannot say enough good things about them. And then for the Thursday night group, which I also facilitate, I would say it really varies because youth don't need parent or guardian consent. Sometimes they just find us out through their friends, just surfing the web, and they just reach out and jump on. Absolutely know of school staff who have encouraged youth to check us out as well. So really all of the above.
You know, one of the things that I see, thank you, Helen, for that, is what we call sort of the transfer of trust, right? If a young person trusts you as their teacher, trusts you as their counselor, trusts you as the custodian, the principal, the admin, whoever, and they're coming to you for support, you saying, you know, have you heard of Side by Side? I think you should check them out, actually makes them sometimes feel more comfortable, right? We've heard that from youth. Well, my counselor said I should check it out, and I trust her, or I trust him, or I trust them. So yeah, I'm going to check it out. So that does help a lot. But word of mouth, you know, you all work in schools, you know how quickly things spread. Youth that really enjoy Side by Side tell all their friends and tell them often, and we love that. So we're always looking for more and more referrals from our community.
Helen, can I interject one thing? I do want to say something else to shout out something that Mr. Ted Lewis is working with me on, is we are really trying to expand our GSA programs and provide more supports. And so you'll be hearing more about that. Ms. Saunders, who's on my team part-time, she's going to be working with Side by Side to begin to do that. So I kind of hear some shout outs in the chat a little bit in chatter about that. And I just want to let you know that it is on our radar and we are looking to do that. And so we haven't quite formed what that's going to look like. So I can't officially presented, but it is coming. We do recognize the need, and we are going to be responsive to it. And again, I thank Side by Side for working closely with us to strengthen the ones that we do have, and potentially and hopefully develop ones where we don't have them.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Dr. Mans. Helen, were there other questions that came up in the chat?
Yeah, I just saw one more. How do we become a youth support coordinator?
Well, Helen, I'm going to defer back to you on that one because you actually run that fabulous program.
I do. So the YSC program, as Ted mentioned, that's really our school staff advocacy program. We have a lot of YSCs that are also GSA sponsors, but that's absolutely not a requirement. The two just overlap very heavily. So really all you do is email me, and I can share my email in the chat if that's helpful. And then once I get your email, I will reach out and let y'all know the next YSC training. And again, the way it goes is you do an intro training, and then from there, I just provide ongoing resources. If there's any question, concern you have, you can email me, we can set up a time to meet. And then I also provide ongoing check-ins and support throughout the school year, the summer. It's just ongoing. And really with the YSC program, we just try to create a space for school staff to connect with other school staff, and everyone can network together, throw out ideas. And the YSCs that we have right now are absolutely amazing. So please reach out.
Thank you for that, Helen. So I'm going to take us into our next section, but please don't be shy by dropping those questions in the chat, and we'll check back in after this section is complete. So a little bit about COVID-19 and LGBTQ students. Now, before I get into the pandemic, I want to share a little bit about what we saw before the pandemic that's continued into where we are today. This is research from the Family Acceptance Project, which is a great resource that talks about LGBTQ youth and their families. What we find is that the three biggest pathways to risk, and risk meaning suicidality, self-harm, mental health distress, low GPA, low mental and physical health, etc. Family rejection, isolation, and a harsh environment. That's it. Those are the three biggest pathways. If this was drawn to scale, family rejection would take up the bulk of the slide. That's really the key. And you all know, working with students, that any student that was not supported by their family, that was isolated from their peers and community, and was impacted by victimization constantly, would be at more risk. And you see that here, right? Now, what does that mean? So that risk, again, we're looking at suicide, self-harm, homelessness specifically in this slide, and this just has some data here. And I'm not going to go into great detail about this, but I do want to highlight a couple of things. Most people kind of know that LGBTQ youth are at greater risk for suicide. We hear that often. It's sort of a common story that's told. I think what's important, again, to recognize is that LGBTQ people are not a risk factor in and of themselves. In other words, being gay or transgender doesn't put you more at risk. It's actually how the community responds to your identity that puts you more at risk. So it is not being LGBTQ that is risky. It is how other people respond to you, right? It's not being gay, it's homophobia. It's not being trans, it's transphobia, right? And when we talk about this, I think that one of the things that always astounds me is that with all of the progress the LGBTQ community has made, and we'll talk a little bit about the backlash we're seeing right now, but even with all that progress, suicide rates among LGBTQ youth have stayed high and even gone up in the last decade. And a lot of that is because of the continued bullying and violence that LGBTQ students face at school and sometimes even at home and in their community. When we talk about homelessness, I think it's really devastating to see this. And we'll talk in a moment about how we're seeing this impacted with the pandemic, because it's going up even more. But LGBTQ youth were already at greater risk because, again, of homophobia and how their family may react. So according to the Williams Institute, LGBTQ youth make up only 9% of the youth population in the US, but account for 19% of foster care youth and 40% of youth experiencing homelessness in the US. They're 120% more likely to experience homelessness than their heterosexual and cisgender peers. That's mirrored in the Central Virginia area, in Richmond in particular, where we see 35% of youth experiencing homelessness identify as LGBTQ, and nearly a third of LGBTQ youth in a national study reported experiencing homelessness, running away, or being kicked out of their home. We talk about bullying. Here's some data from GLSEN from 2017 that looks at high school students in Virginia. The 2019 data isn't quite out yet, but we do have data from 2017. And again, this is from Virginia high school students. 91% reported hearing gay in negative ways, 81% reported homophobic remarks, 82% negative remarks related to gender expression, and 73% negative remarks about transgender people. When we look at things like verbal harassment, physical harassment, and even physical assault, you see the high numbers here. LGBTQ youth are at greater risk for this violence in their community. Now, what about the pandemic? Well, there's limited data on LGBTQ people and COVID-19 because most health institutions do not collect data on sexual orientation and gender identity. For example, the US Census has just wrapped up in its 10-year plan, and sadly, they did not ask questions on sexual orientation or gender identity in the census this year, although it was originally proposed that they do so. The only state that currently collects this data on a regular basis is California, so we have very limited information. But what data we do have shows that LGBTQ people, so not just youth, but all LGBTQ people, are at higher risk because of other health outcomes or other health symptoms. LGBTQ youth and adults are more likely to smoke. They're also more likely to have asthma. And they're more likely to not have health insurance. Now, again, this is mostly for adults on the health insurance piece, but we often see that LGBTQ people of all ages are less likely to access a doctor or healthcare because they're worried about the discrimination they may face. What about the mental health impact? Well, this is where we're seeing this much more show up with the youth that we serve. An increase in anxiety and depression among LGBTQ youth that we serve at Side by Side. And it's hard to sort of measure because it's not as if these were small numbers beforehand. So when we say an increase, we mean a group that had already been at high levels of anxiety and depression, and we're seeing even more of that now. Some youth are at home all day, every day with unsupportive family members. And school was an escape for them. That's where they were able to be their full authentic selves. And now they are sort of hiding who they are at home. We have some youth in our support groups that can only listen in. They can't actively participate or speak because they have parents or family members who aren't supportive in the next room. On the flip side of that, we have some youth who are grateful that they don't have to go to school where the environment was hostile to their very existence. And they have supportive family at home, and being home actually has been very helpful for them. So we're seeing sort of both sides of this coin here, where school was a refuge for some, and where school was a hostile environment for others. And we've also seen youth come out to their family in the pandemic. In fact, we're now seeing more youth who have come out and come to Side by Side who have actually never been to one of our in-person support groups, because we've been in this pandemic since March, and we're a year-round program, right? And so one of the reasons we say that youth are coming out more is because realize that when you're at home with your family all the time, it's harder to hide that part of who you are. When you were able to go to school or work or hang out with friends, you had time away. You weren't always with your family. Well, now because of safer at home orders and the pandemic, we're seeing that shift, and a lot more young people are coming out. Interestingly enough, we work with many corporate partners about LGBTQ inclusion in the workplace, and we actually are seeing an increase in LGBTQ adults come out because they're more comfortable being at home, and they're more comfortable sharing who they are in a virtual setting first before they're back to in-person. So I wouldn't be surprised if you are seeing more students come out in the pandemic than you did when you were in person. And when we are back to in-person, you may see more students be out then because they had this time at home where they could further explore who they were. The last piece I want to note on the pandemic is the economic impact. We're seeing the economy be ravished on all sides right now, and a lot of folks are losing their job, losing their home, etc. According to a study done by the Human Rights Campaign, the top 5 industries where LGBTQ people worked were the most impacted by the pandemic: restaurants and food service, hospitals, K-12 education, colleges and universities, and retail. We know that all of these has been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic and the economic fallout. Before the pandemic, 1 in 5 LGBTQ people lived in poverty compared to 16% of their heterosexual and cisgender peers. And for youth, already I mentioned this, they were already 120% more likely to experience homelessness. For our programs for LGBTQ young adults 18 to 25 who are experiencing homelessness, we used to get 1 to 2 referrals a week. Now in the pandemic, we get 4 or 5 referrals a week, and we are actually full in terms of all of our case management spots, and all of our housing spots are full of young people right now who would otherwise be living on the street and fending for themselves. We're not sure how long the pandemic's going to be. We don't know how long the economic fallout will continue, but we're trying our best to meet not only the mental health needs of LGBTQ youth, but ultimately some of the basic needs of that young person and their family. And I think you all are already seeing this with families who have lost their job, families who have, had to shift in order to best meet basic needs. When we talk about LGBTQ community, we've been focused a lot on youth, but it's important to recognize that you do have LGBTQ parents, caregivers, guardians who also have students in your school. And that's going to have an impact as well, as they may, again, have the impact of their losing jobs or losing their business, etc. So I know that was a bit of a downer. I apologize for that. It's never fun talking about the pandemic. But I want to pause here in terms of any questions related to LGBTQ youth in the pandemic or anything we've covered so far before we get into our next section on Black LGBTQ youth specifically.
Yeah, we have a couple. I missed this one earlier, my apologies. The question is, do we accept monetary donations, or are there other forms of support folks can offer?
So, you are speaking my love language, friend. We love a good monetary donation, and we are right actually in the midst of our Let's Get Better Together in Quarantine Challenge, or our LGBTQ Challenge fall fundraiser. All that information's on our website. It's a great way to get involved, raise money. Think of it like a virtual 5K, but you don't have to do a walk or a run. You could choose any betterment project you want. So we have got some folks who are improving their home, reading more, working out more, getting civically engaged, etc. And we're trying to raise $30,000 by November 13th. So that's our current fundraiser. There's also great volunteer opportunities. We do look for volunteer facilitators. It sometimes gets tricky if you're a teacher or a counselor in the school system, because we want to make sure that the students don't have overlap. But we're happy to work with you if you're interested in volunteering. And again, that youth support coordinator is a great way to get involved if you're really looking to build a relationship with Side by Side in your school.
The next question we have is, do you see higher different rates of homelessness by race?
Yes, that's a great question. That's actually something we'll talk about in this next section. The majority of young adults in our homelessness services are Black youth.
13, which I don't see over here.
Oh, I think somebody might not be on mute, so just check your mutes there. But to answer your question, we do see higher rates of homelessness with LGBTQ youth of color broadly, and specifically Black and Latinx youth. And in the Richmond area, we're seeing it much more with Black LGBTQ youth specifically.
And that's all we have so far.
Okay, great. Well, that's the perfect segue question into our next section. So when Dr. Manns reached out, we were talking about sort of what are the hot topics we need to talk about right now. And one of them is the most recent iteration of the Black Lives Matter movement and the uprisings we've seen in Richmond and across the country in relation to police violence and racism in the fabric of America. Now, when we talk about the Black Lives Matter movement, one of the things I want to amplify is that if you look at the actual policy directives of the movement, it specifically calls out justice for LGBTQ people, right? It specifically talks about positive policy change that does center Black people and Black people's experiences, but also talks about that across different intersecting identities. And so the Black Lives Matter movement has been LGBTQ inclusive from the beginning, and you could argue is an LGBTQ movement just as much as it is a racial justice movement. 2 of the 3 founders are out queer women who have been very public about their identity and their members of and their membership in the LGBTQ community. So when we talk about this, the reason I share this is because a lot of times people focus on the racial aspect related to Black Lives Matter and don't realize that there's a full policy here that really is all-encompassing related to seeking justice for underrepresented groups. that again centers Black people, but looks at things like immigration and economic justice and LGBTQ justice and environmental justice, etc. Now, there's been some reports that have come out in the last 2 years from Trevor Project and Human Rights Campaign that look at the experiences of Black LGBTQ youth specifically. So one of the things I wanted to share is the statistical differences between Black, lesbian, gay, and bisexual youth and their Black heterosexual peers. This is data actually from the Center for Disease Control, and it's a couple of years old, but it illustrates again that gap that we're seeing, that Black, lesbian, gay, and bisexual youth have higher rates of suicide, higher rates of feeling sad, hopeless, and higher rates of even suicide attempts. A study, again, that was done by the Human Rights Campaign last year found that 80% of Black LGBTQ youth usually feel depressed or down. 71% usually feel worthless or hopeless. 80% usually feel worried, nervous, or panicked. 46% feel critical of their LGBTQ identity. In other words, they have some form of potential self-hatred for who they are. And only 35% had received some form of counseling in the past year. So we know that what helps is having culturally competent counseling that looks not only at someone's gender and sexuality, but also their race and ethnicity. And so when we talk about the needs of Black LGBTQ youth, it's important to really focus on that intersection of multiple marginalized identities, of being LGBTQ and being Black. And when we talk about their school experiences, we see that 40% of Black LGBTQ youth have been bullied on school property in the last year. Only 35% said they could definitely be themselves in school. And 67% had been verbally insulted because of their LGBTQ identity. Now, when we talk about Black LGBTQ youth and their experiences, sometimes people jump to the false assumption that Black adults and Black communities are somehow more homophobic or transphobic than their white peers. And that is just not true. Now, homophobia and transphobia look different in different communities, and a lot of times they are tied to faith, but not always. Black communities and Black people are not more homophobic or transphobic than white communities or white people. They're just not, but it does look different. And when you already have a marginalized identity based on your race or ethnicity, having an additional marginalized identity based in gender or sexuality, that sort of double whammy impact can be really hard not only for that youth to process, but for that family to be supportive. We often see caregivers who are wanting to be supportive, but aren't sure how. We see that across racial and ethnic lines, but we particularly see it with Black caregivers. Now, we've done some studies and some research, and our hope is to be bringing some new mental health counseling specific for Black LGBTQ youth in the new year. So be on the lookout for some more information coming about that, hopefully in the coming months. But we think it's important to, again, recognize that LGBTQ youth come in every race and ethnicity, are a part of every community. One of the areas that we want to focus on as we wrap up this section on the connection between the Black Lives Matter movement and the needs of LGBTQ youth is the reality that LGBTQ students are in the school to prison pipeline at significantly higher rates, and specifically, again, Black and Latinx youth. So this study done by the Center for American Progress found that LGBTQ youth make up between 5 to 7% in their study, but represented 15% of those in juvenile justice system, with the vast majority, again, being Black or Latinx. We also have found that sometimes it's the hostile school environment that's driving this. Lesbian, gay, and bisexual youth are up to 3 times more likely to experience harsh disciplinary treatment. And studies show that higher rates of punishment do not correlate with higher rates of misbehavior among LGBTQ youth more broadly. And that 1/3 of LGBTQ youth report that school officials fail to address the harassment, which leads to distrust of school administrators. Side by Side has been very vocal that we believe that school discipline should be something that is done within the school system and not involve law enforcement. What it means when law enforcement is involved is that an incident of disciplining a student shifts from detention at the school to detention at a detention center. And a minor incident of a fight shifts from you have to come in Saturday or you're expelled to you're now living in a facility and a part of the prison to school, or excuse me, school to prison pipeline. Now, simply eliminating law enforcement from our schools is not going to solve this issue. It takes a look at our disciplinary practices. It takes a look at our resources and what we're giving students and families to ensure that we're meeting their needs. And sadly, we've relied more and more on our schools to provide basic needs for their students because a lot of folks are falling through the cracks. And I think we're going to see that only increase with the pandemic and the economic fallout we're seeing right now. But locking up more kids is not going to be the answer. So we're sharing this because, again, as we talk about that school to prison pipeline, we need to focus on the racial dynamics because even within the LGBTQ population, youth of color are more likely to be impacted. But LGBTQ students face a specific sort of marginalization within this conversation that often gets lost. Now, before we get into our last section related to the election, I want to check back in and see if we have any questions in our chat.
Yeah, we have one question. Do we have specific training for culturally specific needs support past the initial training, or is it all encompassing?
So I wish it was all encompassing, but I have yet to find any training that can truly be all encompassing in a short amount of time. Our basics training does provide basic information about the community, goes into sort of LGBTQ one-on-one to greater detail, goes into details on risk and protective factors and what we know works to support LGBTQ youth. It is always evolving and changing, and we're looking to add more cultural competence around youth of color specifically in that training, and that's going to be rolling out in the coming months. We also have what we call the practice, which is more about taking the information you learn from the basics and putting it into practice in your school. So that's about how do you then create a GSA? How do you create services and resources? What does inclusive curriculum look like? And it tries to touch on those areas. I'll also say that we regularly work with schools and school districts to craft specific trainings and conversations based on your needs. Sometimes it looks like this, where we share a little bit of information, try to have a dialogue. Sometimes it looks like roundtables where we answer questions and talk through problems and work with you around policy. So if you have an idea for what you'd like to see in your school, we'd be happy to talk through options and opportunities with you. Helen, I know you do some of the trainings. Did you want to add anything related to sort of what we see in our training programs?
No, I mean, I think really we try to customize exactly what you said, Ted, of what y'all are seeing in a school community, because of course there's a lot of overlap across schools in Virginia, but every time I interact with the school, you can absolutely feel a difference in energy, of culture, of how the students and the staff navigate each other and separately. So I think really trying to create a custom training that best fits y'all is probably like one of the biggest offer we can have with that.
Great, thank you for that, Helen. Were there any other questions that came in before we enter into our last section?
I just got one about GSAs and if we're interested in helping, and absolutely, I will visit a GSA all day long. So please reach out with GSA stuff.
Yes, absolutely. Happy to help with that. Please do reach out. And one of the things to note about GSAs is that you can see a pretty big culture shift in a school with a GSA over the course of even just 3 years. We worked with a school in Henrico that had a GSA. In their first year, they had 8 members, and it was a little rough. The second year, their GSA got a standing ovation at homecoming. Fast forward, it's one of the largest student clubs today at that high school. So you can see culture change shift pretty quickly when you put resources in place, and that's what we're here to help you with. And as Helen said, they're more than happy to work with you and to work with your GSA leaders directly, so don't hesitate to reach out. So getting into our last section, I want to give a big caveat before I jump into this. And that's to say, we're going to talk about how some elected officials talk about the LGBTQ community, but in no way am I pointing fingers at any particular person or party. The reality is there have been anti-LGBTQ remarks made by leaders of all political parties, and no political party is perfect in their support or lack thereof for the LGBTQ community. So this is not to say you should vote a certain way or to support a particular party, but it's to talk about the reality of what LGBTQ students hear and what they're experiencing right now with the election. Now, the first piece here is to recognize that does have an impact on their mental health. A Trevor Project 2020 national survey found that 86% of LGBT youth said that recent politics have negatively impacted their well-being. And we see this all the time in the youth that we serve. I'll give you some examples of this, and some of these you may be familiar with. These are tweets from President Trump, where he announced the ban on transgender people serving in the military. There's a big conversation to be had about transgender people and military service and access to healthcare, et cetera. One of the things that was lost in this conversation is that there were many transgender students who were in ROTC programs across the country who saw their future disappear with a single tweet. That has a negative impact on their mental health. That limits their possible futures, that possible next step for them. That's going to have an impact on how they see themselves and how they see the world around them. Vice President Mike Pence attended a ceremony at a church in January of this year where the pastor at that service said it's demonic spirit that causes a woman to want to lie with another woman. It's a demonic spirit that causes man to be attracted to another man. When you see elected officials in the highest offices work with faith leaders that are spewing such hatred against who you are, it's going to have a negative impact in your mental health and your mental well-being. Now, this has shifted since we even made this presentation, but the addition of Judge Coney Barrett to the U.S. Supreme Court has many in the LGBTQ community worried about the future of our rights. As the first day of the Supreme Court of the United States term saw current Justices Alito and Thomas call for a potential overturning of Obergefell. Can't pronounce that, apologies. That's the case that legalized same-gender marriage across the country. So you're going to have families, same-gender families, that are worried about whether or not their marriage is going to be legal in the coming years. That's going to have a negative impact on that family. You've got a lot of folks living in fear right now of the future of what their family looks like. And again, it's not just LGBTQ youth, but it's LGBTQ families, those parents, those caregivers who are worried about their relationships being legally recognized in the US. And when we talk about this, I want to give you an example based on our school data. So this is data over the years. It is research that we have from LGBTQ youth who attend our programs. Realize that because it's LGBTQ youth coming to side by side, the data is a little skewed because they're coming to a support group for help. So we would already expect some of these numbers to be pretty high. We also wanted to, again, be transparent. This is not all of the youth we serve. Currently, we serve about 450 unique youth a year through Richmond, Charlottesville, and Petersburg. This is about maybe 50 to 60 to 70 of those youth. So it's a snapshot. We do one in the fall, one in the spring. And I'll give you an example. This is one of the questions. How often do you feel afraid of getting hurt by someone at school? And so we ask it again every year, and here you see the chart. And I noted when the election happened, because again, we're focusing on when LGBTQ youth hear their identities being debated on a national stage and what that impact shows. So here we see an increase that has gone up and then down and then up again with the election that happened in 2018. And then we see it going up again here at the end. When we ask youth, in the past 6 months, have you self-injured? We see a very sharp increase during the election. When we look at suicidality, again, we see a sharp increase. And we're seeing that go up again. Now, again, I'm not pointing fingers at any particular candidate or any particular party. I'm saying when a national conversation happens around who you are and your legal rights, that has a negative impact on your identity. It also shines a spotlight on you. When same-gender marriage was passed by the Supreme Court, it was a big win for our community. But we also saw LGBTQ youth become the center of conversation in their schools in ways that maybe they weren't quite ready for. So that conversation that's happening about transgender people serving in the military, or gay couples being allowed to marry, or non-discrimination in the workplace, or access to healthcare, that has a negative impact on LGBTQ students. So where do we go from here? Here are some possible next steps. We're happy to again provide that training for educators in your schools, develop and support gender and sexuality alliances in middle schools and high schools. And we're getting more and more conversations around what that might look like at the elementary age as transgender youth in particular are coming out at younger ages. You might want to identify some supportive school staff to receive additional support through our Youth Support Coordinator program. And ensure that LGBTQ inclusion is accompanied by inclusion for all marginalized identities, as LGBTQ students and families are a part of every community. That's one of the things that we're really grateful in working with Dr. Manns and her office, is that there's an intentionality around ensuring that everyone is included. One of my favorite studies done on GSAs found that when a GSA is in a school, and it was done specifically in high schools in California, and there was a similar study done in high schools in Canada, it found that schools that had GSA had lower rates of anti-LGBTQ bullying. No surprise there, we would kind of expect that. Interestingly enough, that same study found that it had decreases in bullying for all students by having a GSA. And the second group to most likely benefit from a GSA, even if they were never members, was cisgender heterosexual boys. And the reason for that is because boys are often bullied because of their gender expression or their sexuality. They're called names like sissy or faggot or worse. And when you have a GSA that's stepping in and saying, those are not okay, that's not how we talk about each other here, and they're viewed positively, it takes away that tool of the bully to call those students that name. It's not 100% going to work. It's not a silver bullet, but it's shown to actually decrease that. We also know that doing simple things like using a transgender student's chosen name dramatically increases their mental health. A study was done 2 years ago by Dr. Stephen Russell that found consistently using a transgender student's chosen name at home, at work, with their peers, and at school decreases suicide attempts by 65%. 65%, simply by using the chosen name of a transgender child. We know what works. It just takes us to be brave enough to put those into action. Now, we do have some resources in the links here, and I want to just mention a couple of them before we get back to our questions and close out for the day. GLSEN has great resources and great research on GSAs and K-12 schools. GSA Network is exactly what it sounds like, Gender and Sexuality Alliance Network. It's a national network of GSA support, again, in K-12 schools. And they also have great lesson plans for GSA advisors and leaders, or projects that you can do within your GSA. The Trevor Project has some great new research, but also has a lot of information on LGBTQ youth suicidality. They have a national hotline that's available 24/7, 365 that can be accessed through phone, chat, or text. PFLAG and He, She, Ze, and We are parent and family groups. They work with parents and families of LGBTQ community members. And PFLAG is an oldest organization. It's been around since the 70s, and it is a national group, and we have a chapter here in Richmond. He, She, Ze, and We was founded in Richmond as a local organization that specifically works with family members of transgender people of all ages. One of the things we really try to drive home when we work with schools and communities is that when you're trying to provide support for LGBTQ youth, you also need to ensure that their parents and caregivers and family members have access to support as well. When a young person comes out, sometimes the whole family comes out, and there needs to be a space for parents and guardians to process what they're going through in reaction to their child coming out. And they need that and deserve that space. And that's what PFLAG and He, She, Ze, and We can offer. One of our youth actually described He, She, Ze, and We as, quote, the magical place upstairs where my parents learned how to use a pronoun. And it was the first time that the parents had been able to hear, because they were talking to other parents, the importance of names and pronouns. Gender Spectrum offers great resources on specifically transgender and non-binary youth. They do have more and more resources for schools and educators. And lastly, Teaching Tolerance is the education wing of the Southern Poverty Law Center. And they have lesson plans, videos, resources for K-12 educators on diversity, multiculturalism, LGBTQ inclusion, disability inclusion, and many, many more topics. Now, we wanted to leave space for questions. when I initially did this, this was going to be solo, and Dr. Mans and Leslie had the brains to say, no, you're going to need somebody to help out with chat. So a big thank you to Helen for jumping on. They're going to drop their email in the chat for you as well, in case you wanted to reach out to them about the YSC program or GSAs. But we want to use our last little bit here to answer any questions you all have, and you're welcome again to drop those in the chat. So Helen, do we have any questions in the chat?
Not right now in the chat, but I have a couple that were sent before the training.
Okay, if you want to go ahead and start with those.
Yeah. How can we best support and advocate for students that aren't supported by parents and guardians? And do we have any resources that we can provide to parents?
Great question. So, one of the things I always advise folks is to have conversations with your leadership team in your school, or to reach out to folks like Dr. Mans and her team in the equity office to really get what's specific to your county, right? What I will say is what we often see with school districts, and this is backed up in the conversations we've had with the Department of Education in Virginia, is that if the student is a minor, which most of the time they are, you will need to defer to the legal guardian's wishes. So for example, if you have a transgender student that goes by a chosen name instead of their legal name, and their guardian contacts you and says, you can only call my student their legal name, what we've heard is you have to follow that legal guardian's wishes. Now, this is tricky because we know how important using a transgender student's chosen name is, and so there's the ethical thing to do, and then there's the legal thing to do. And because this is a quandary, that's why we advise you to talk to your leadership team, talk to Dr. Mans, get support within your community. Every situation is unique, so we're also happy to answer those questions. We actually get that phone call quite often. A lot of it depends on kind of where the family is. So we've had parents, caregivers, and guardians who are flat out not supportive, don't want to talk about it, not going to budge, period. And then we've also had folks that have, concerns. My child's too young. I'm worried that this is because of trauma they may experience when they were younger, and that's the reaction to that. They're not really LGBTQ. We've had folks that are saying, well, my kid might be this, but they're gonna have to wait till they're 18, or I have concerns related to my religion and faith. And so we try where we can to work with youth and their families to get them the resources they need, and they may be very specific to that family. PFLAG, He, She, Ze, and We are great resources for those parents. And both organizations do offer virtual support groups right now in the virtual setting. He, She, Ze, and We, I believe, is currently meeting twice a month right now on Thursday evenings. And then PFLAG meets the first Tuesday of each month. There's some information and links on our website to get to them directly. What I'll also say is the leaders of both of those groups also do one-on-one conversations with caregivers if they want to ask questions, if they want to talk through stuff. And so those are the best resources to give to those parents that may be unsure. I will also say that educators play a key role in this. The more that you can normalize being LGBTQ for that parent or guardian, the more likely they are to be accepting. So if you, for example, if a young person shares with you that they're gay and they've told you that they've come out to their family and they're looking for support, if you're going to that family and saying, Ted shared that they were gay and that's so great, I'm so glad they were honest with you and they shared that with you. If you're celebrating that, the family is more likely to celebrate that with you. If you're coming to them and say, I have something serious we need to talk about. Ted came out and said they were gay. We need to talk. They're going to think something's wrong with their kid. One of the things we talk about in our training is that the likelihood of an LGBTQ youth having an LGBTQ parent is really small. The other thing we know to be true is that parents and guardians use their own lived experience to train their kids how to survive the world. And if they're not part of the community, they don't know how to prepare their kid to be gay or be transgender in the world. So a lot of that comes from a place of fear, of getting it wrong, of doing the wrong thing, of their kid somehow being the weird kid, the abnormal kid, the kid that needs additional help. And they're nervous about that. So the more you can normalize it, the more you can make it something to celebrate, the more likely the parents and guardians are to come back with a positive attitude. Helen, did you have anything else you wanted to share related to that?
No, that was summed up beautifully.
Were there other questions that came in the chat or beforehand?
Yeah, we have one more beforehand. How can we be supportive and bring up LGBTQ community concepts if it does not obviously correlate with our content, I'm gonna guess, in the classroom.
Great. So, one of the things I will say is because of that gender binary we talked about before, because of that assumptions that's made that everyone is heterosexual and cisgender, that is pervasive. And so any person you're learning about in class,
We're about to leave.
the assumption is they're heterosexual and cisgender, right?
Yeah.
One of my favorite things
Hold it
at oh, I think we may have another person who's off mute, just so you know.
I'll be out of here by 5:30.
Oh, I think that might be Dr. Mans. All right.
Hello?
We can still hear you on our end. That's all.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. No worries. Welcome to the virtual world. I think we're all used to this happening at this point. So one of the things that, to say is, again, that assumption that everyone is heterosexual and cisgender, right? Now, a way to think about this in a different context, it's not the same, but it's similar, is I guarantee you have a history book in your school that says Barack Obama was the first African-American or multiracial president of the United States. You also, in that same history book, will probably find that JFK was the first Catholic president of the United States, right? What you don't see is George Washington was the first white president or the first Protestant president of the United States, but he certainly was. Again, that was the assumption. That was the assumed default. So no one had to write that in the history book. The same thing is true for LGBTQ identities. My favorite example of this is, again, I'm the executive director of Side by Side. I am very out publicly about being a member of the LGBTQ community. And I pretty consistently, when we were in person, run across young people who are shocked that I am non-binary, that I use they, them pronouns, that I'm part of the community. I've had youth say, oh, well, what does your wife think about you working at Side by Side? I'm not sure who this woman they keep thinking I live with is, but I don't have a wife. And no offense, I don't want one. But again, these are students that are coming to an LGBTQ support group. They see the staff. And again, that assumption of heterosexuality and being cisgender is there. So I say all that to say that if you are talking about LGBTQ people, you have to be blunt and you have to say, this is a gay person, right? Or, for example, I learned in public school in Virginia in high school all about Langston Hughes and his beautiful poetry and his great work in the civil rights movement. And no one told me that Langston Hughes had relationships with other men until I got to college. That would have been revolutionary as a high school kid to learn about that. And it would have been as simple as dropping that nugget in the conversation. It changed for me how I understood his poetry, how I understood his life. So those small moments help a lot. The other thing is to think about ways to do it that are sometimes not as obvious. Some of the easy ways is if you're in a foreign language, are all the examples you're giving of couples going on a date heterosexual? Can you have a same gender couple in the examples? Can you have a transgender student as the example, right? So Maria now goes by Mario, right? That's a sentence. How would you form that sentence? How would you conjugate that verb, right? There are ways to sort of incorporate it in that way. When we talk about things like math and science, sometimes it's a little bit harder, but again, not impossible. Sometimes it's about thinking through how we talk about lessons, right? So I'm not saying all math teachers do this, and maybe this was just my math teacher, but she talked about equations as a marriage. And so you have the man on this side and the woman on this side, and you want to make them equal. And that's how she talked about it. I'm not saying this is how everybody teaches it, but in my mind, I was like, well, I don't want a wife, so I don't care about math, right? But again, there's ways you could think about trying to expand that. It's also small things like when you talk about, for example, biology, and you talk about XX and XY chromosomes. We know that there's more than just that in science. And again, simply making space for there to be more than just that dichotomy allows for that expansion of possibility for LGBTQ young people and for their peers to see LGBTQ people positively in their curriculum. Now, we'll give a caveat. Anytime you're doing curriculum changes, you should definitely be having that conversation with your school leadership. You should definitely be having conversations with central office because you want to make sure that it's age appropriate. You want to make sure that it's in line with what the county is expecting you to teach. And I always am grateful for advocates that are pushing the envelope in their community. But I want to remind you, the best way you can support LGBTQ kids in your school is by still being employed in your school, right? Don't push so hard that you're putting yourself at risk. And again, I'm not saying that Henrico County is somehow bad or they would do that, because they're absolutely not. We've had a great relationship with Henrico County. We have a great relationship with Dr. Mans and the other leaders. But again, the best way you can support LGBTQ students is by being a member of that community and staying in it. And so sometimes you're the best advocate, sometimes it's your students, sometimes it's their family members, sometimes it's side by side. Figure out where your role is in that advocacy. Now, getting back to curriculum, Teaching Tolerance, again, is a great resource that has those lesson plans available. Gender Spectrum also has some amazing resources, and GLSEN has a couple of good ones. Most of those are focused more on after-school programs lesson plans, but again, could be incorporated into the classroom. So we've got about 10 minutes left, and again, we built in a lot of time for questions because we wanted you to have space to kind of talk through whatever you needed to. So Helen, are there other questions that have come up in the chat?
Not yet, no.
Okay. Dr. Mans, was there anything else you were hoping we would maybe touch on since we've got a couple minutes left?
Let me take myself off of mute now. Let me just say, you all did above and beyond anything I expected. I just am so blown away. I've learned so much. I'm over here like jotting down notes. I got new language that I'm going to try to make sure that I am more mindful about. And so again, for me, I'm constantly learning at your feet. And I truly mean that. When I first came on and took this position, I did my listen and learn. You all opened your doors to me and just began the education. And so again, I sit here today and learn some more. And so I'm so excited to see so many people here and stayed on for the entire presentation. That's a testament to the information that you shared. And I just look forward to us having a stronger partnership. I mean, you and I have worked behind the scenes to do some things that we were, you know, you got to be strategic. And so I think now our county is prepared for there to be some more outwardly facing things, which is really where I see us moving. And so I'm really excited about this growing partnership, particularly around GSAs and strengthening those. So to go there, I have some questions. So one thing is about the basic training for the LGBTQ T+. Is that a paid event? How does that work? And can I bring you in to offer training and what that might look like? And we can talk off camera, but I would like everyone to hear that because I feel like that's going to be a follow-up question later on.
Absolutely, happy to share that. So thanks to some amazing funding we received from local partners like the Robbins Foundation, United Way, Community Foundation, there is no cost to local schools for that training. So Henrico is a part of our footprint, just like Richmond City, Chesterfield, Hanover, as well as our Charlottesville branch. And what I will say is we've shifted our language. We used to say it's free. It's actually not free. We just have grant funders that are paying for it. So it's free to the school. Now, we do work with other counties across the Commonwealth. We just did a training up in Arlington, for example, and with them, we do charge a nominal fee. I'll also note, even though you all are, of course, in Henrico County Public Schools, the same is true for private K through 12 schools in the area. And we do work with private institutions as well. So again, as long as you're in our footprint, which all of Henrico County is, there's no cost to the school for our basics training, our practice training. Any of the resources we offer to your school are no cost to your school. And sometimes we have individual schools reach out to do a training. Sometimes it's on the district level, someone like a Dr. Mans or other leaders. And what I would say is if you're interested, because Dr. Mans has been such an ally to the community and has been listening and has been trying to plan this stuff, I would suggest for folks to reach out to you to say, hey, we're interested in this, would love to learn kind of what the plans are. Because while we love doing the trainings, it's sometimes better to have a plan to roll out in a county versus going sort of popcorn style with whoever invites us in. So if you're interested, we're happy to answer any of your questions. But again, Dr. Mans has been a big ally to our community, and we do recommend you kind of connecting with her. I hope you're okay with me saying that, Dr. Mans.
No, I really appreciate that because I think that's what I'm working with Ms. Saunders on, so we can really formulate a comprehensive plan around what that's going to look like. Because I'd like, I don't think that, like, as you said, one training isn't going to be enough. We have a large district. We have a lot of needs. And so I want to make sure that we create enough opportunities for people to get in, to have the conversations. And I really would love to talk more, and I'm interested more in hearing about the mental health part, because I want to see more school counselors and social workers and psychologists in this conversation. Not that I don't want teachers in there, but I think there's like different spaces that I'd like us to kind of to support. Obviously, the curriculum, which is very near and dear to my heart to see that being more inclusive. That's one conversation. But then I also hear what you all said about how are you being intentional about bringing people in to support our Black LGBTQ plus students. So I would like to have that conversation and bring in particular groups. So again, I'm going to be reaching out to you because I see this training being multidimensional, comparable to kind of being one that just kind of covers everything.
Right. And one thing to note on that is that we just did what we call a more clinical training for counselors with the Chesterfield County Community Service Board. So those are mental health providers in Chesterfield County. We did our regular basics training, which looks a little bit different for mental health providers in the community than a mental health provider in the school, because there's different resources, right? But it's similar content. And then what we did is we spent time basically doing the way that clinical supervision works. We would have case studies and we would talk through as a way to practice with those counselors. And again, while it's directed at counselors, we opened it up to anybody in that CSB who wanted to join, but it was, again, as you noted, intentional about this is what you may see as a counselor. And that looks a little different than a teacher, right? One of the big things we advocate among the school advocates and leaders that we have is to know your limits, right? So I always love to say, I love giving trainings, but I'm not a clinician. But I have wonderful, fabulous clinicians like Emma Yaxo, our Director of Youth Programs and Services, and Dr. Griffin, our clinician, our counselor, who have that experience, who have that training, who can then deliver those content pieces. So it may not always be me, it may be Helen who's on this call with us, it may be others, but we're more than happy to work with y'all. And again, all of those that I'm mentioning are no cost. It really comes down to scheduling, because as we all know, as we're learning today with the double dipping of 2 events happening at the same time, schedules are hard to line up sometimes.
Well, again, I just want to say thank you so much for being here with us. Thank you for sharing all this wonderful information. And I know I'm going to get a ton of follow-up emails tomorrow, and this is going to go out, and I want to make sure that everybody's aware of this. Everyone who signed up, we had over 70 people sign up for the training today, but remember we had competing interest. They're all going to get the training. I am also going to send the training to some of our directors. I think that need to really hear some of this information, and I want to send it potentially out to our school counselors. So there's going to be a number of groups that we are going to, again, be intentional about sending this information to, because I just think you shared such a wealth. Even I was blown away by some of the data that you showed, and I think that we need to really wrap our heads around that as we're thinking through and making decisions moving forward. So again, I thank everyone who was on the call, particularly those presenters and your assistants. So thank you all.
Hey, Monica, we had someone that had their hand raised. I was just making sure they didn't have a question. It was one of our principals, Ken.
Oh, Dr. White.
Yes, ma'am. And I'm sorry, I'm in transition now, so I may have missed something. I wanted to, thank you all for your presentation. I definitely appreciate you all. From the principal level, I had a question. Do you all have just some real practical tools that we can use like tomorrow to be able to help lead this work on the grounds in our buildings? Because it's very important work. And as we look at making more inclusive settings and making sure that our folks, not only our students, but our staff as well, making them feel included, making them feel welcome, I would love to be able just to kind of talk. And this may be in the trainings, and I appreciate Dr. Manns for speaking to having a comprehensive plan. But I guess that was my question. Just, are there any like little bullet points, nuggets that you feel that we can take away as leaders of our individual buildings to help lead this work on the ground?
Yeah. You know, I think that the couple pieces I would offer to you is that the biggest thing is getting sort of the full team at your school to understand that you've got LGBTQ students there who may need some, unique support. And providing them support has shown to actually improve outcomes for all students, because when you support the most marginalized among us, all boats get raised, right? All the tide rises for everyone. And I think that what we have found in our work is a lot of questions currently come down to, again, transgender students and how they interact in school. So while that is specific to transgender students, the impact of those policy shifts, those practice changes impacts cisgender, gay, lesbian, and bisexual youth as well. And so we released earlier this year a guide on some suggestions on transgender policies based on our work with the Virginia Department of Education. That's currently on our website now, and I'm happy to send that to you as well if you want to follow up with us. And we also are awaiting the guidance that will come out. It's supposed to come out in December or January from the Department of Education. And the reason I mention that is because a lot of this stuff is some structural pieces that individual schools may be able to implement, but maybe need to be done on the county level. In terms of things you could start tomorrow, I would say looking for staff who are ready to volunteer as youth support coordinators, get that additional training from Helen and resources so you've got a point person who can be a liaison to the community. And then the second piece was around GSAs. If you've got a GSA, how can we help you strengthen it? If you don't have one, how can we help you start one in your school? So those would be some of the key points. But again, happy to talk one-on-one if you've got more in-depth questions, and always happy to bring training and resources to your team.
I definitely appreciate that, and I will be following up. And I know prior to me transitioning to my car, I saw a bunch of Springer teachers on here, so I definitely appreciate them for being a part of this conversation, and I'm really excited about being able to get this work done.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So we're going to turn it back over to Dr. Manns and her team to close us out, I think.
So this is Leslie, Dr. Manns' assistant. Dr. Manns had to step out for another engagement, but I just want to, again, thank Side by Side for your presentation. It was a wealth of information. And for those who are still on the call, this was recorded and we will be posting onto our YouTube channel. And I will also send a link out to everyone who signed up for this event, for those who couldn't make it, for those who are here, who just want to have their information at their fingertips. So again, I just want to thank Side by Side for this wonderful presentation, and to, again, just thank you.
Thank you, Leslie, for all your help, and you all have a great rest of your evening.
You too. Bye, everybody.
Ms. Brown, are you still on?
Yes, I'm still here.
Are you able